It started with a look. The kind of look that doesn't last more than a second but says everything. Suspicion, doubt, disbelief. She stood there, small but dignified, holding out a check with trembling hands. Her fingers, thin and worn from years of work, gripped the paper tightly, as if letting go would somehow give this young man permission to question her worth. The teller glanced at the amount, his eyebrows arched, his mouth pressed into a flat line. "This check," he said, slow, measured as if each word weighed a ton, "is quite large." She nodded. "Yes, it is." "And you're looking to cash it today?" "That's what I'm here for." There was no anger in her voice, no irritation, just quiet certainty. But the teller wasn't ready to hand it over. He scanned her face, deeply, as if trying to find a crack in her story. Then his eyes dropped to the address on her ID. Then back to her. "I'll need to verify a few things. Please wait a moment." He disappeared behind the partition, check in hand. She stood still, silent. A few customers behind her in line started murmuring. She could hear every whisper. She always heard them. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this branch manager, the man the teller had just gone to find, wouldn't be another skeptical face. He would walk out. He would see her. And without a word, he would rush forward and wrap her in his arms. Because the woman standing patiently at the counter, that was his mother. Her name was Lorraine, 74 years old, retired nurse, raised 4 boys on her own in East Baltimore, working double shifts for most of her life. She'd just sold the small house she'd lived in for 40 years, the same house she'd fought to keep during 2 recessions, rising property taxes, and 1 major plumbing disaster. That check she handed over, it was the final payment from the sale. She wasn't rich. That money was meant to carry her through the rest of her life. Lorraine had chosen that particular branch because it was on her way to her new apartment. She didn't recognize anyone there, not that she expected to. She wasn't looking for favors. She just wanted to deposit the check and get on with her day. The teller's name was Brandon, fresh out of college, hired 6 months ago. He'd been trained well, at least when it came to policies and procedures. But there was a second layer of training he never received, one that taught you how to read people without bias. When Brandon saw the check, $92,000, something in him hesitated. Maybe it was implicit bias, maybe it was inexperience, maybe it was both. All he knew was that the woman in front of him didn't fit the picture he'd built in his head of someone holding a check that size. So he stalled. Meanwhile, Lorraine waited, calmly, almost predictably. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs. The suspicion wasn't new. It had followed her through clothing stores, car dealerships, airports, and now banks. Behind the scenes, Brandon approached the manager's office. "Hey, Mark, I've got a situation at window 2. Elderly customer, large check, something feels off. Can you take a look?" Mark looked up from his desk. "Define off." Brandon hesitated. "It's just the amount, and she's not a regular here. I thought maybe you could verify the check or speak with her." Mark sighed. He'd had a long morning, meetings, system glitches, a no-show from one of the tellers. He didn't want to deal with another fraud claim, but something in Brandon's tone made him stand. He walked toward the front of the bank, adjusting his tie, slipping into the professional mask he wore daily. But the second he turned the corner and saw who was standing at window 2, everything else dropped away. His mouth opened. His steps quickened. "Ma?" Lorraine turned. A smile crept onto her face. "There you are." Mark didn't wait for explanations. He didn't look at the check, the ID, or the teller's confused expression. He just walked straight into his mother's arms and held her tight. Customers stopped what they were doing. Brandon blinked, stunned. "Everyone," Mark said, still holding his mother. "This is Lorraine Patterson. My mother." The room went silent. Lorraine chuckled softly. "I told you I was just here to deposit my check." Brandon's mouth opened, then closed. He looked down at the check in his hand, like it had just transformed into something radioactive. Mark turned to him. "You gave her trouble?" "No, I mean, I wanted to verify—" "She's my mother," Mark said again. not with anger, but with weight, the kind that forces you to realize how badly you've misjudged someone. And you treated her like a stranger trying to pull a scam, Brandon stammered. I was just following procedure. Mark stepped forward. If this was an elderly white woman handing you that same check, would you still be in my office right now? The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Brandon didn't answer, because everyone already knew. Lorraine stepped in, her voice calm but firm. He's young. Maybe now he'll learn. I've dealt with worse. Mark looked at her. You shouldn't have to. Not here. Not anywhere. The rest of the transaction was handled quickly. Brandon, now sheepish and quiet, returned to his station while another teller helped Lorraine finalize the deposit. Before she left, she turned back toward Brandon. Be better, she said simply. No anger, just truth. He nodded, face flushed, and then Lorraine walked out head high, purse in hand, as the branch slowly returned to its routine, but no one forgot what they saw. Mark stood by the door watching her leave. He hadn't seen her in weeks. They'd spoken on the phone, sure, but life was busy, work, the kids, everything. He hadn't known she'd be coming by, but now that he'd seen how she was treated, even by someone under his leadership, he knew something had to change, and not just in his branch, but in how we all see people we don't know. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story, because what happened next changed everything. Mark stood at the door long after his mother disappeared down the sidewalk, the glass still faintly fogged from where her palm had pressed against it. He'd spent years building that branch, training staff, refining protocols, but in a matter of minutes everything felt exposed. Not just the system himself, his blind spots, his distance. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of Lorraine standing alone at the teller window, answering questions she shouldn't have had to answer, played over and over in his mind. Not because it was new, but because it wasn't. Because it had happened before. To her. To others. Probably even in his branch, while he was locked in meetings or buried in reports. The next morning, Mark called Brandon into his office. Brandon arrived stiff and silent, still carrying the embarrassment from the day before. He sat down slowly, unsure if he was about to be reprimanded or fired. Mark didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he pushed a single photo across the desk. Lorraine, in scrubs, holding a newborn baby. Mark himself, in a hospital ward in 1985. She worked night shifts, weekends, holidays, Mark said. Came home with swollen feet and migraines. She walked me to school, then went right back to work. Brandon shifted in his seat, his eyes not quite meeting Mark's. I didn't mean... But you did, Mark cut in, his voice low. You just didn't know it. And that's the problem. You didn't see a customer. You saw a threat. Why? Brandon hesitated. I don't know. You do, Mark said. You just don't want to say it out loud. There was a long silence. Then Brandon spoke, almost in a whisper. She didn't look like someone with money. And what does that look like exactly? Mark asked. Because I've seen wealthy men in hoodies and sandals. I've seen broke guys in $1,000 suits. If you're judging by the surface, you're not doing your job. You're just performing your bias. Brandon didn't speak. Mark leaned back in his chair. You're not the only one, but you are responsible for what you do with it. Outside the office, the day moved on like normal. Customers came and went, phones rang, forms were signed. But for Mark, something had shifted. He knew this wasn't a one-time conversation. It had to be the start of something bigger. Later that week, Mark invited Lorraine over for dinner. She arrived just after 6, wearing the same soft blue sweater she'd worn to church every Sunday for years. The kids ran to greet her, and she handed them each a caramel from her purse, something she'd done since they could walk. In the kitchen, while the lasagna baked, Mark poured 2 glasses of iced tea and sat down across from her. You didn't tell me you were selling the house, he said. I didn't want to bother you, she replied. Figured I'd handle it. You always do. They were quiet for a moment. Then he asked, Did you expect that kind of treatment at the bank? She smiled without humor. I expect that kind of treatment everywhere. Doesn't mean I'm not tired of it. I should have done better, trained them better. Maybe. But they're not just learning from you, Mark. They're learning from the world. He looked at her, really looked, the lines in her face, the steady way she held his gaze. "How many times has that happened to you?" She shrugged. "Too many to count. But you want to know the one I never forgot?" Mark nodded. "I was 28. Your oldest brother was still a baby. I went into a bank with a government check. The teller smiled at me, then walked into the back. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers came out and asked me to step outside. They thought the check was stolen. I stood there on the sidewalk holding my baby, while they ran my ID like I was some criminal." Mark's jaw clenched. "Why didn't you tell me that?" "What would have changed?" she said softly. "You were a kid. I didn't want you growing up thinking the world was against you. I wanted you to believe it could be better." He swallowed hard. That night, after she left, he started drafting a training module, not just on fraud detection, not just on verification procedures, but on dignity, on how to serve people, not assumptions. He brought in community speakers, hired diversity consultants, organized role-play sessions with real-world scenarios. Brandon was the first to volunteer for every session, not out of guilt, but because something had cracked open in him, and he knew it needed work. 2 months later, Lorraine returned to the bank, this time not with a check, but to speak. Mark had invited her to share her story with the staff if she was willing. She agreed. When she walked in, the room quieted. She stood at the front, looked at each face, some nervous, some curious, and began, "My name is Lorraine Patterson. I've been a nurse, a mother, a homeowner, and a taxpayer for over 50 years. And in that time, I've been treated like a thief more times than I can count. Not because of what I did, but because of how I looked." She paused. "You may not have written the rules, but you have the power to change how they're used. You can choose to look deeper, to ask better questions, not just, is this check real, but am I being fair?" She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. When she finished, Brandon stood up and walked to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not just for what I did, but for what I didn't see." Lorraine nodded. Seeing is where it starts. 6 months passed. Mark's branch saw a shift, not in numbers, not on spreadsheets, but in atmosphere. Customers stayed longer. Conversations got warmer. And complaints about discrimination? They dropped to 0. One afternoon, as Mark was closing up, a new teller approached him. "There's a woman here," she said. "Elderly, check in hand. Says she's not sure how to deposit it. Should I walk her through the form?" Mark peeked around the corner. It wasn't Lorraine, just another woman who reminded him of her. He smiled. "No," he said. "You sit with her. Listen. Make sure she feels safe. Then help her with the form." The teller nodded and walked off. Mark stayed behind watching from a distance, and for the first time in a long time he felt like maybe, just maybe, his mother had been right all along. The world could be better. You just had to choose to see it.